Ravi had always believed that his life would never change, that he was destined to carry bricks and struggle just like his father before him. But when an unexpected opportunity knocked, he had to make a choice: stay in his comfort zone or risk everything to build a new future. Little did he know that one decision would change his life forever. Ravi wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand as he shifted the heavy sack onto his shoulder. The midday sun was merciless, beating down on him as he trudged across the construction site. His muscles ached, but he had no time to rest. The supervisor barked orders, and he moved quickly, knowing that slowing down would only invite harsh words or worse, a pay cut. He had been working at this site for months now, carrying bricks, mixing cement, and doing whatever backbreaking labor was required. It wasn't the life he had dreamed of as a child, but it was the life he had been given. He had come to the city years ago, hoping for something better. Back in his village, life had been simple but hard. His father was a farmer, tending to a small piece of land that barely yielded enough crops to survive. Every year, they prayed for rain, and every year, it seemed their prayers went unanswered. Droughts came often, and with them, hunger. As the eldest son, Ravi had started working in the fields at a young age, his small hands digging in the dry soil alongside his father's. He had never been to school. Education was a luxury only the rich could afford. When the drought hit harder than ever, his family had no choice but to leave. The farm could no longer sustain them, and with a heavy heart, they packed their few belongings and set off for the city. His father had heard stories of men finding work there, earning money to send back to their families. But the city was not the land of opportunity they had imagined. It was overcrowded, noisy, and unkind to the poor. They ended up in a slum, a cramped collection of tin-roofed houses with narrow alleys where thousands of others like them struggled to survive. His father managed to find work as a laborer at a construction site, but the years of struggle had weakened him. The long hours and physical strain took their toll, and within a few years, his health began to decline. Ravi, barely a teenager, had to step up. There was no time to dream of a different life. He had to work, had to earn, had to put food on the table for his mother and younger sister. His days became a routine of endless labor. He would wake up before sunrise, eat a simple meal of leftover rice if they had any, and set off for work. The construction site was several miles away, and he walked the distance every day, unable to afford the cost of public transport. Once there, he worked until his body felt numb, lifting, carrying, mixing, building. By the time he returned home, the sky was dark, and exhaustion weighed him down like a heavy chain. There were moments when he allowed himself to think of something beyond this life. He would see men in clean clothes, wearing helmets, discussing blueprints and giving instructions. Engineers, the workers called them. They were the ones who decided how the buildings were made, who oversaw everything. Ravi wondered what it would be like to have that kind of knowledge, that kind of power. But those thoughts were dangerous. They led to disappointment. He was a laborer, nothing more. Still, there were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their small room, unable to silence the questions in his mind. Was this all he would ever be? Would he spend his entire life under the weight of bricks and cement, his body worn down by endless work? There had to be something more. But what? He had no education, no special skills. He had no connections, no family wealth. The world was not made for men like him to rise. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, he sat by the roadside, watching the city lights in the distance. From where he sat, they looked beautiful, like stars scattered across the horizon. He wondered what it must feel like to live in one of those tall buildings, to have money, to eat without worrying about the next meal. He sighed, shaking his head. Dreams like that belonged to other people, not to him. As he stood to leave, he overheard a group of workers talking nearby. They spoke about a new project that was about to start, a big one. It would require skilled labor, not just ordinary workers. The engineers were looking for people who could read plans and follow detailed instructions. Ravi listened intently, his heart beating a little faster. He knew nothing about reading blueprints, but he had always been quick to learn. If only someone would give him a chance. But just as quickly as the thought entered his mind, doubt followed. Who would take him seriously? He was just another laborer, barely noticed among the hundreds of men working at the site. Even if he wanted to try, how would he? Approaching an engineer felt impossible, like trying to reach the top of a mountain with no path. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. As he lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, he imagined himself working alongside the engineers, wearing the same clean clothes, holding the same plans in his hands. He imagined giving instructions instead of taking them. The thought filled him with both excitement and fear. Days passed, and the idea continued to haunt him. Every time he saw the engineers discussing the project, he felt a tug inside him, urging him to speak up. But every time, fear held him back. What if they laughed at him? What if they dismissed him without a second thought? One morning, as he was carrying bricks to the site, he saw one of the engineers, Mr. Mera, speaking with the supervisor. Ravi hesitated, then gathered his courage and stepped closer, just within earshot. "We need more skilled workers," Mr. Mera was saying. "This project requires precision. We can't afford mistakes." The supervisor sighed. "We don't have enough trained men. Most of them aren't interested in learning new skills." Something in Ravi snapped. Before he could overthink, he stepped forward and spoke. "Sir, I want to learn." The word surprised even him. The two men turned to look at him. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. "You?" Ravi swallowed hard but nodded. "Yes, sir. I am willing to work hard. I want to learn." There was a moment of silence. Then Mr. Mera spoke. "Are you serious about this?" "Yes, sir," Ravi said firmly. The engineer studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Be here tomorrow morning. If you're truly willing to learn, we'll see what you can do." Ravi's heart pounded. He had done it. He had taken the first step. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. That night, he couldn't sleep. The fear was still there, whispering doubts in his mind, but another voice, the one that had pushed him to speak up, was louder. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. Opportunities didn't wait, and he had finally gathered the courage to grab one. Now, it was up to him to prove that he was more than just a laborer. Ravi arrived at the construction site earlier than usual the next morning. The sky was still a deep shade of blue, the city not yet fully awake, but his heart pounded with anticipation. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. This was his chance, and he could not let it slip away. As the first workers trickled in, Ravi stood near the engineer's station, waiting. The other laborers gave him curious looks, wondering why he wasn't heading to the usual work area. He ignored them, focusing only on what lay ahead. Mr. Mera arrived shortly after, dressed in his usual crisp white shirt and helmet. He spotted Ravi and nodded. "You're early. That's a good start." "Yes, sir," Ravi said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Follow me," Mr. Mera instructed, leading him toward a table covered with blueprints and construction plans. Several other men were gathered there, experienced workers who were already familiar with the technical aspects of the job. Ravi suddenly felt out of place. These men knew things he didn't. What if he wasn't capable? What if he embarrassed himself? Mr. Mera didn't give him time to dwell on those thoughts. He picked up a blueprint and unrolled it on the table. "All right, let's start with the basics. Do you know what these lines represent?" Ravi leaned forward, scanning the intricate drawings and markings. He had seen blueprints before, of course, but he had never tried to understand them. He hesitated before answering. "No, sir, but I want to learn." Mr. Mera smiled slightly. "Good. That's all that matters." Over the next few hours, Ravi listened intently as the engineer explained the symbols, measurements, and design elements that made up a construction plan. At first, it felt overwhelming. There were so many technical terms, so many numbers and angles. But Ravi was determined. He asked questions when he didn't understand. Something, repeating information to himself, so he wouldn't forget. The other workers seemed indifferent to his presence, some even skeptical. He overheard one of them mutter, "He's just a laborer. What does he think he's doing here?" Ravi's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. He reminded himself why he was here. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove to himself that he could do this. By the end of the day, his head was spinning with information, but he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had taken a step towards something new, something different from the life he had always known. That night, he couldn't sleep. Instead, he replayed everything he had learned, whispering terms and definitions to himself in the darkness. His younger sister stirred in her sleep, and his mother let out a tired sigh from her corner of the small room. Ravi felt a pang in his heart. This wasn't just about him. This was about them too. If he could secure a better future, his family wouldn't have to struggle so much. The next morning, he returned to the site with renewed determination. This time, Mr. Mara gave him a measuring tape and a notepad. I want you to take measurements and compare them to the blueprint, he instructed. Ravi nodded and got to work. At first, it was difficult. He double-checked every measurement, afraid of making a mistake. He kept looking at the blueprint, trying to match the numbers. Mr. Mara corrected him when necessary, but encouraged him when he got things right. Days turned into weeks. Ravi worked harder than ever, balancing his regular labor job with the technical training. It wasn't easy. His body ached, and exhaustion often threatened to take over. But he refused to give up. He spent every spare moment studying, memorizing, and practicing. One evening, as he was going over measurements, Mr. Mara approached him. "You're learning fast," he said, nodding approvingly. "Thank you, sir," Ravi replied, his heart swelling with pride. Mr. Mara studied him for a moment before saying, "You remind me of myself when I was younger." Ravi's eyes widened. "You were a laborer too, sir?" Mr. Mara chuckled. "Not exactly, but I came from a small village. My family had nothing. I worked hard to get where I am." His expression turned serious. "Opportunities don't come often, Ravi. When they do, you have to seize them." Ravi nodded, understanding the weight of those words. One day, as he was working on a new task, one of the senior workers approached him. "You've been working with the engineers a lot lately," he said, his tone laced with something Ravi couldn't quite place. "Yes," Ravi replied cautiously. The man scoffed. "Don't forget where you come from. People like us don't become engineers." Ravi felt anger rise in his chest, but instead of lashing out, he simply said, "Maybe we can." The man shook his head and walked away, but Ravi didn't let his words affect him. He knew people doubted him. He knew they thought he was reaching too high, but he didn't care. He had come too far to stop now. As the weeks went on, his skills improved. He could read blueprints with confidence, take accurate measurements, and even assist with calculations. He wasn't an engineer yet, but he was no longer just a laborer. He was becoming something more. One evening, Mr. Mara called him over. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "We need someone to assist with quality checks. It's not a labor job, it's a technical role. You'd still have a